The town I grew up in was pretty rural, to put it lightly. There was nothing but farms, crops, abandoned churches, and worn-down houses. Everyone around us was struggling financially. Property taxes were around $11,000 a year, if that. As a result, the area attracted a lot of strange characters. Even our neighbor was a bit odd nice, but weird. We weren't well off either, but things got a little better when my siblings and I were old enough to work. Around the time that the app Hot or Not was still popular, I matched with a girl named Kelly. We started seeing each other for a while, beginning in late summer and continuing through September. By early October, Kelly and I were looking for a cheap date. There wasn't much to do in our area. We'd already gone hiking, explored, and eaten at the local spots, so we decided to take a drive down a new route we'd never been on before. We eventually found a small restaurant sitting in a random parking lot on the side of the road. It had outdoor seating, so we decided to eat there. It was a warm, cloudy day when we arrived, and we sat outside. After about 45 minutes to an hour, we left, and the weather had grown noticeably foggy. We continued driving down the unfamiliar road, which was desolate, with only open fields and farmland on either side, and occasional patches of trees. After driving for a while, we passed something different, a sign for a pumpkin patch. The sign was cheaply made, just a wooden picket sign that read, "Pumpkin picking this way," with an arrow pointing to the right. Behind the sign was a dirt driveway cutting through the field. Through the fog, we could see a house that the driveway led to. On a whim, we decided to check it out. I drove down the driveway, passing the house into a back area surrounded by trees on two sides. Tucked between the house and the woods was a big pumpkin patch, scattered with at least 200 pumpkins. That was just what we could see through the fog. We parked next to an old pickup truck, the only other vehicle on the property. As we got out, we noticed an older couple sitting on the back deck of the house. They greeted us as we approached. I told them we were there for the pumpkin picking, and the old woman smiled and said, "Welcome. Pick anything you'd like." When I asked how much the pumpkins would cost, she replied, "It's free." Kelly and I were surprised but grateful. The fog made it hard to see them clearly, and the atmosphere felt a little creepy. Still, the couple seemed nice, even though the old man's gummy smile was a bit off-putting. We thanked them and wandered into the pumpkin patch. Many of the pumpkins were small, mushy, and unattractive, and the ground was wet from the fog, making it harder to find a good one. Eventually, we found a big, healthy-looking pumpkin. It was heavy, but I picked it up and carried it back to the deck. Oddly, the older couple was no longer there. I asked Kelly if we should just leave, and she agreed. We had already thanked the couple, and they had told us the pumpkins were free. So we got back into the car, and as I started a three-point turn to leave, we suddenly heard someone yelling. Startled, we turned to see a middle-aged man in a cap running toward us, shouting, "Hey, stop." I rolled down the window, and the man angrily shoved his face inside, yelling, "What the hell are we all doing?" "I'm calling 911, I asked what we did wrong, and he demanded, "Put that pumpkin back right now." Kelly and I tried to explain that the older couple had told us the pumpkins were free, but the man cut us off, saying, "What older couple? I ain't got no parents." Confused, we told him about the older couple sitting on the back deck 10 minutes ago, but he insisted there were no older people living with him. He then asked where the pumpkin was. I told him it was in the back seat, and I unlocked the door. He grabbed the pumpkin and warned us never to return, or he'd shoot us. He spat on the ground and walked back to the house. Shaken and confused, I drove us out of there. We thought, maybe it was some kind of sick joke. Half jokingly, I said, "What if they were ghosts?" Kelly, clearly freaked out, told me to stop, but even I got chills as I considered the possibility. There was silence in the car, as we both pondered the unsettling thought. Out of curiosity, my siblings went to that same pumpkin patch later to pick a pumpkin. They met the same man and asked about the older couple. He insisted he lived alone, which made the whole experience even more disturbing. If he wasn't lying, then who were those people? To this day, I still can't make sense of it. When I was in high school, a group of friends and I decided to explore an abandoned house on the outskirts of our town. The house had always intrigued us. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it was haunted, but no one dared to venture inside. One weekend, fueled by curiosity and teenage recklessness, we decided to check it out. We arrived at the house just before sunset. It was a 2-story building, with cracked windows and ivy crawling up the sides, its wooden doors hanging slightly off the hinges. The house looked like it had been deserted for decades. The air around it was thick with an eerie silence, and the wind seemed to carry whispers of something unknown. As we entered the house, the temperature dropped significantly, and a strong, musty smell filled our noses. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior, with old furniture covered in dust, broken glass scattered across the floor, and mold creeping up the walls. We moved cautiously from room to room, trying to suppress our fear while joking nervously to lighten the mood. Halfway through our exploration, we heard a loud thud coming from upstairs. Everyone froze, staring at each other in wide-eyed terror. We debated whether to leave or investigate the sound. Finally, against our better judgment, we decided to head upstairs. The staircase creaked under our weight as we ascended, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. When we reached the top, we were met with a long, dark hallway. At the end of it, a door was slightly ajar, and we could see a faint light flickering inside. Gathering all our courage, we slowly made our way toward the door. Pushing it open, we found ourselves in what looked like an old bedroom. The furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols we couldn't understand. In the middle of the room stood a rocking chair, rocking back and forth on its own. The room felt unnaturally cold, and a sense of dread washed over us. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut. Panic set in, and we tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then, without warning, we heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around us. It was speaking in a language none of us recognized. The rocking chair started moving faster, and the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly. Terrified, we pushed harder against the door until it finally gave way. We ran down the hallway, tripping over each other in our haste to get out of the house. As soon as we stepped outside, the air felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the house. That night, we all swore never to go near that place again. We never spoke of what we saw, but we all knew something unexplainable had happened. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that night in the abandoned house. I was around 22 years old when I experienced one of the most chilling encounters of my life. It was a late summer night, and I was returning home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. I had taken this particular train ride dozens of times before, but that night something felt different. The air was unusually still, and a dense fog had settled over the tracks, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. I boarded the train just before midnight. The car I entered was completely empty, which was strange given that this route was usually busy even at that hour. Shrugging it off, I found a seat near the window, put on my headphones, and tried to relax. The train jolted forward, and we began moving through the fog-covered countryside. After a few minutes, I noticed something odd. The usual rhythmic clattering of the train on the tracks seemed off slower, almost like the train was moving through molasses. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the thick fog swirling around the train. That's when the lights in the car flickered. At first, I thought it was just a minor electrical issue. But then, the lights went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. I took off my headphones, and suddenly I realized that the usual hum of the train had stopped. There was no sound at all, not the engine, not the wind, not even the faint creak of the train's metal frame. It was as if everything had come to a standstill. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but to my horror, it was dead even though it had been fully charged just moments before. Panic started to creep in. I tried standing up to make my way to the door, but before I could move, the lights flickered back on. However, something was different. The car was no longer empty. Sitting just a few rows ahead of me was a figure, hunched over, dressed in an old, tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. I hadn't heard anyone enter the car, and I was certain it had been empty just a minute ago. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen in my seat, watching the figure intently. Without warning, the figure slowly turned its head towards me. The face, if you could call it that, was pale and distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away. Suddenly, the train lurched forward violently, and the figure disappeared. The lights flickered again, and the train's engine roared back to life. I stumbled out of my seat and rushed towards the nearest door. When I finally made it out of the car and into the next one, it was filled with people, all going about their business as if nothing had happened. I looked back, but the car I had just left was completely dark and empty again. For the rest of the ride, I sat in the crowded car, too terrified to look back. When I reached my stop, I bolted off the train and ran home, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. To this day, I still don't know what I saw on that train, but I do know one thing: I never took that route again. For the month of October in 2016, I worked at Party City as a seasonal employee. It was a hectic time due to the Halloween season. Naturally, I was assigned to night shifts on weekdays, as I didn't have early classes. The location where I worked extended its closing hours to 11 p.m. during Halloween. My shift typically started at 5 p.m., and I worked until closing. The rush would die down after 9 p.m., and by 10 p.m., the store would be almost empty, especially on weekdays. On the day in question, I started my shift as a costume grabber. I would receive instructions via walkie-talkie about what costume and size to grab for customers to try on. As the night progressed and the store quieted down, I was assigned to clean the aisles, restock, and move items between the store and the basement. This task became tiring quickly due to the constant trips up and down the stairs. By 10 p.m., there were only 4 of us left in the store: Maria, who worked the cash register; Kyle, who was cleaning and restocking; Ashley, the supervisor; and me. During one of my trips to the basement, I noticed that the lights had been turned off, likely by Ashley. I flipped the switch back on and descended into the basement. While lifting a box of girls' costumes, I heard a thud from the other side of the basement. The basement was a circular room filled with boxes, with a large shelf in the middle. Slowly, I peered around the shelf and saw someone in a white hooded robe and a scary monster mask. Initially, I jumped back, but then I laughed, assuming it was one of my coworkers playing a prank. The person didn't speak, just tilted their head, as if still messing with me. At first I thought it was Ashley, but then I realized this person was too tall to be her. It had to be Kyle. I approached the figure, intending to remove the mask, but they backed away. I glanced down and saw dirty, heavy work boots that I knew Kyle wasn't wearing. A chill ran through me. I hurried back upstairs, avoiding the appearance of panic, and went straight to Ashley, who was chatting with Maria near the register. I asked where Kyle was, and he called out from a nearby aisle. Panic set in as I realized the person in the basement wasn't Kyle. I told Ashley that someone in a costume was in the basement, but they didn't belong there. Kyle and Ashley accompanied me to the basement to investigate, but like a cliché horror story, the person was gone. There was a back exit in the upstairs costume room, used for unloading shipments. It was possible the intruder had slipped out through there. Ashley sped through the security footage, but no one had entered the costume room except for me. Unfortunately, there wasn't a camera in the basement or the costume room itself to capture any further evidence. Part of me thought it was still a prank, but I had a job to do. I had to return to the basement and finish stocking the costume room. When I returned, I picked up the box of girls' costumes again and made my way to the stairs. I paused because I thought I heard the sound of a plastic bag being crumpled. I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was, so I hauled the box up the stairs, dropped it off in the costume room, and returned to the basement door. Before shutting off the light, I looked down the staircase. At the bottom of the stairs was the person in the white robe again, this time without the mask. I saw his face smiling up at me. I slammed the door shut and ran to Ashley and the others, screaming for help. They rushed to the costume room, but the back exit was wide open, and the basement door had also been left ajar. Whoever the person was, they were gone for real this time. The one security camera outside didn't capture anything, and I never found out if the intruder had stolen anything beyond the costume. I'll never know if it was just an elaborate Halloween prank or if he had more sinister intentions, but I treated the situation like my life was in danger. My favorite month has always been October. The temperature is perfect, never too hot and never too cold. The leaves turn orange and brown, and there's always a refreshing October breeze. When I was a kid, my friends and I would rake up piles of leaves in my yard and have wrestling matches in them. I have fond memories of those days, especially from ages 9 to 12. One year, when I was about 11, it was late October, and a lot of leaves had already fallen. Since my yard was the biggest, my friends Liam and Billy came over to help rake the leaves into a giant pile. It was a cloudy, windy day, and we were getting tired as it got late. My house sat on a corner lot with a large yard next to a sidewalk that led to a short, dead-end street. The dead end had only two houses, one owned by an old stoner couple who didn't care about anything, and the other, a small, dilapidated house whose owner never seemed to come outside. This meant we could be as loud as we wanted without bothering any neighbors. We wrestled in the leaf pile for about half an hour before heading inside for snacks and video games. After some time, Billy and Liam wanted to go back outside for another wrestling match. We called it a triple threat match and pretended we were WWE wrestlers. By the time we went back out, it was nearly dark. The streetlight near the dead end lit up part of my yard, giving us just enough light to see. Right away, we noticed there were fewer leaves in the pile. We tried wrestling again, but the pile was too spread out, so we grabbed our rakes and began rebuilding it. As Liam raked, he discovered a long, oddly shaped pile of leaves. He called us over, saying there was something underneath. We helped him clear the leaves and screamed when we uncovered a grown man hiding beneath the pile. We froze, unsure whether to laugh or run. Was this some kind of Halloween prank? The man's face was still covered, so Billy dared Liam to expose it. Slowly, Liam approached the body and kicked away more leaves. That's when we realized it wasn't a person at all, it was a fake body, planted as a prank. But by who? Our question was answered when we noticed a man hiding in the bushes nearby. We shouted. We see the man, laughing, stepped out. He was older, probably in his 60s, and looked creepy. He had bulging eyes, crooked teeth, and was breathing heavily. He said he planted the fake body there because he always watched us play in the leaves and thought it would be funny. His comment about always watching us sent a chill down my spine. Liam tried to be polite, but I felt uneasy. I told my friends, "Let's go inside," and we left the man standing there. I told my dad what happened, and he went outside to check, but the man and the fake body were gone. Later that night, as we played video games, we agreed the guy was a total freak. After my friends left, I went to my room to relax. I had my window open for some fresh air when I heard a man's voice. Startled, I looked up but couldn't see anyone. The voice said, "I didn't mean to creep you out earlier. I live across the street, and I like watching you kids play in the leaves." It was the man from earlier. He then tried to push my window open and climb inside, but he was too big to fit. He started reaching for me, so I screamed for my dad and ran upstairs. My dad rushed to my room, but by the time he got there, the man was gone. We went to his house across the street and knocked on the door, but he didn't answer. My dad called the police, and when they arrived, we returned to the house. This time, the man answered the door. It was him, and the police quickly realized something was off. They suspected he was on drugs, possibly meth. I was too young to understand, but now, thinking back, the house was in shambles, a perfect fit for someone addicted to meth. All those years, we never knew there was a creepy meth head living across the street, watching us play. In October 2016, I was working the Halloween season at Party City. It seemed like a great time. Costumes, decorations, and excited chaos filled the air as people prepared for one of the most fun holidays of the year. I even volunteered for the night shift in October, thinking it would be quieter after dark. I imagined myself stocking shelves and organizing costumes, with only a few last-minute shoppers to help. What I didn't expect was for that shift to turn into something straight out of a horror movie. It was a week before Halloween, and the store was buzzing with customers rushing to grab costumes. The chaos didn't settle down until about an hour before closing. That night, I was working with Sarah and Josh, along with a few others handling the front of the store. My job was to manage the backstock, which meant frequent trips to the basement to grab extra costumes and decorations to restock the shelves. The basement at Party City wasn't anything special, just a large, damp room filled with old racks, boxes, and leftover Halloween decorations from the previous year. It was a bit creepy, but I tried to tell myself it gave the place character. The shift was going smoothly until around 9 p.m. when I made my third or fourth trip down to the basement. I was grabbing boxes of fake cobwebs and plastic spiders when something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe the way the light hit one of the Halloween decorations. But when I looked directly at it, my stomach dropped. Someone was standing at the far end of the basement near the old storage racks. The figure wore a long white hooded robe and a mask that covered their entire face. The mask was smooth and featureless, just a blank, white face staring back at me. I immediately thought it was Josh playing a prank. He was known for messing around, especially during Halloween. "Nice try, Josh. You're not scaring me," I called out. There was no response. The figure remained still, staring at me. I laughed, thinking he was committed to the joke. I grabbed my boxes and started walking toward the stairs, glancing back at the figure every few steps. It hadn't moved. Something felt off. The robe wasn't one of ours, and the mask, it wasn't one of the cheap plastic ones we sold. It looked too detailed, too real. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped and turned fully toward the figure. Okay, seriously, Josh, it's late. Let's not do this. Still nothing. Just silence. I was getting annoyed now. I set the boxes down and took a step toward the figure, ready to pull off the mask and end the joke. But as soon as I moved, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing behind the storage racks. I froze. If it were Josh, he would have said something by now, or at least laughed. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of the robe, just silence. Josh, I called out again, but my voice sounded shaky now. I walked slowly toward the spot where the figure had vanished. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I peered around the corner of the storage rack, fully expecting to see Josh crouch down, ready to spook me. But there was no one, just dusty old boxes and leftover Halloween decorations. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe Josh had slipped out when I wasn't looking. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned to head back to the stairs. Then, the figure was back. This time it stood much closer, in the same spot near the old storage racks. It hadn't made a sound. No footsteps, no rustling of the robe, just silence. My mouth went dry. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky. Still no answer. I backed toward the stairs, my eyes locked on the figure. With every step, I expected it to rush at me. But it didn't move, it just stood there watching. At least I assumed it was watching. The mask made it impossible to tell if there were eyes behind it. When I reached the stairs, I grabbed the handrail and bolted up 2 steps at a time, slamming the door shut behind me. I just wanted to get back to the front of the store where the lights were brighter and other people were around. Sarah was behind the counter, restocking candy. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my panicked expression. "Did anyone go down to the basement?" "No," I blurted out, my voice more frantic than I wanted it to be. "Why?" I opened my mouth to explain, but I didn't even know where to start. Telling her about a hooded figure in a mask standing silently in the basement sounded insane, even to me. "Never mind," I muttered, brushing it off. "It's probably just Josh messing around." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Josh left an hour ago." My heart sank. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. If Josh wasn't in the basement, then who or what had I seen? Before I could say anything else, a faint creak echoed from the basement door. Both Sarah and I turned toward the stairwell. The door, the one I had slammed shut, was now slightly ajar. "I locked it," I whispered, more to myself than to Sarah. Her eyes widened. She took a step back, reaching for her phone. What the hell is going on? The basement door creaked open a little wider. Then we saw it. The figure stood halfway up the stairs. Its mask, its face, I still couldn't tell which, glowing slightly in the dim light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, silent, unmoving. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "Call the cops," I whispered. She nodded, fumbling with her phone. But before she could dial, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the basement again. The door creaked shut behind it. We stood there, stunned, not knowing what to do next. Finally, our manager Greg arrived. We told him what happened, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably teenagers trying to scare us. But Sarah and I knew better. This wasn't a prank. Something, or someone, was down there that shouldn't have been. Greg eventually called the police, just to be safe. 2 officers showed up and checked the basement, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. They wrote it off as a Halloween prank gone too far. I quit the next day. Sarah lasted another week before she left too. Neither of us wanted to stick around to see what else might happen. I still don't know who or what I saw in that basement, but I'll never forget the way it watched us without ever making a sound. And every October, when the air starts to get colder and the Halloween decorations go up, I can't help but think about that night, about the figure in the white robe, and how it never made a sound. Growing up in a small town, there wasn't much to do, especially once the weather turned cold. But every October, a massive pile of leaves would magically appear in old Mr. Keller's front yard. It became the center of our fall afternoons. That pile, made of crisp fallen leaves from the giant maples that lined the street, was our playground. As long as we didn't ruin the rest of his yard, old Keller never said a word. Sometimes we'd see him just standing in the window, watching us silently from behind those dusty curtains. At the time, it didn't seem strange at all. There were 4 of us who practically lived in that pile: me, Tommy, Ryan, and Jess. We weren't little kids anymore, we were in middle school, but there was something about that leaf pile that brought us back to simpler times. After all, in our small town, the simple things were the best things, and nothing seemed like it could ruin that. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the air had a bite to it, the way it always does when fall creeps closer to winter. We had just finished a game of street football, and our jerseys were sticking to us with sweat. There it was, the giant mound of leaves, just waiting for us to dive in. Mr. Keller must have raked all morning to get it that big. It stood taller than some of us, like a colorful mountain of autumn. "Last one in's a loser," Tommy yelled, already sprinting toward the pile. Without thinking, we all took off running full speed into the leaves. The pile exploded in every direction, leaves raining down like confetti. We dove in, tossing handfuls at each other, laughing until we couldn't breathe. It was like being little kids again, rolling around without a care in the world. We buried each other in the leaves, disappearing under the colorful blanket, then leaping out like monsters, roaring and tackling one another. This went on for nearly an hour until we were completely exhausted. As the sun began to set, the laughter died down, and we lay in the leaves, catching our breath. It was the kind of peaceful, quiet moment that only comes after hours of carefree fun. That was when I first noticed it, a soft rustling sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the pile. I sat up and looked around. Jess was lying back, staring up at the sky with her arms outstretched. Tommy was poking Ryan with a stick, trying to start another fight. "You hear that?" I asked, looking at Jess. "Hear what?" she asked, confused. "That noise," I pointed toward the pile of leaves. "Like something's moving in there." Tommy chuckled. "It's probably just a squirrel or something. Stop freaking out." I wasn't convinced. The rustling was getting louder, and it was definitely coming from the pile right from the center. Jess squinted at the leaves, concerned. "Yeah, I hear it too now." Ryan stood up. Dude, it's just leaves. You're being paranoid. But the rustling didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. Then, to my horror, the pile actually moved. It wasn't a small shift, like when a breeze catches the edge of it. No, this was more like something underneath was trying to push up through the leaves. The mound of color shifted and swayed like it was breathing. My stomach clenched, and my mind immediately raced to the worst possible conclusion. "Okay, what the hell?" Tommy finally muttered, standing up. Ryan still looked unconvinced, but even he took a step back, keeping his eyes locked on the pile. "I'm telling you." "There's something in there," I said, stepping backward, away from the rustling leaves. Jess had already moved behind me. Tommy walked over to the pile and nudged it with his foot. Nothing happened at first, just a little flutter of leaves as they settled back down. But then the pile erupted. Leaves scattered in all directions as something burst out from underneath. We screamed, all four of us. A man stood there, hunched over. His clothes were filthy and torn. His hair was matted with leaves, and his face was smeared with dirt. His eyes were wide and wild, darting between us as if he wasn't sure what he was seeing. Or maybe he didn't care. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. It was like we were frozen in place, staring at this thing that had just emerged from our leaf pile. Then the man spoke. "I've been watching you." That's when I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't even look back. I just ran, sprinting down the street. I could hear Jess's footsteps right behind me. Tommy stayed. I heard him shout something, his voice full of anger. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled. But I didn't dare turn around. Ryan was the next to run, and by the time we reached the end of the block, he was right behind us. Jess was sobbing, clutching her sides, and I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. We huddled together, catching our breath, too afraid to say anything. Finally, I mustered up the courage to look back at Keller's yard. Tommy was still there, standing in the leaves, face to face with the man. "What's he doing?" Ryan whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know. He's just talking to him." "Talking? We have to get him out of there." But before any of us could move, the man took a step closer to Tommy, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in Tommy's body, the way his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without warning, the man laughed. He straightened up and turned his back on Tommy, walking slowly toward the edge of the yard. For a brief moment it seemed like everything was over, that this nightmare was just some twisted prank. But then, just as the man reached the bushes at the edge of Keller's yard, he stopped. He turned around, his eyes locking onto us from across the street. "I'll be seeing you." With that, he disappeared into the bushes, leaving the four of us standing there, trembling and confused. Tommy walked over to us. "He's gone," he said simply. "What did he say to you?" Jess asked, her voice shaky. Tommy shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the man had disappeared. "Nothing important. He's just some weirdo." But there was something in Tommy's voice, something that made me think he wasn't telling us the whole truth. I didn't push it though. None of us did. We were just glad to be away from that man. We spent the rest of the afternoon at my house, trying to make sense of what had happened. Ryan suggested we call the cops, but Tommy shot that down immediately. What are we going to tell them? That a crazy guy popped out of a leaf pile. They'll laugh us off the phone. Jess nodded, still shaken. "I just want to forget about it." So that's what we did. We didn't talk about it again, not for the rest of the weekend, and not in the weeks that followed. But something had changed after that day. We stopped playing in the leaves. We stopped going near Keller's yard altogether. We found other things to do, other places to hang out. But every time I walked past Mr. Keller's house, I couldn't help but look at the pile of leaves, thinking I'd see that man again, hiding beneath the surface, waiting. He never came back. Not that we saw anyway. Who was he? Why was he there? And most importantly, what was he planning to do? The memory of that day still haunts me even now. I left the party later than planned. It was one of those Halloween gatherings where everyone was supposed to dress up, eat candy, and maybe have a few drinks. I didn't put much effort into my costume, just a black hoodie and some face paint, calling it a night. It wasn't really my scene, but I had promised a friend I'd show up. That promise kept me there long enough to see most of the guests leave. By 1 a.m., I decided I'd had enough. It had been raining on and off all night, and by the time I stepped outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour. My car was parked a couple of blocks away, so I jogged down the slick pavement. The road was quiet, too quiet for Halloween. No trick-or-treaters, no late-night walkers, just me and the sound of my sneakers splashing through puddles. When I got to my car, I sat there for a moment, letting the sound of rain against the windshield calm me. It felt good to be alone, away from the noise and costumes. The thought of my warm bed was the only thing keeping me going at that point. I turned on the engine, flipped the windshield wipers on, and pulled out onto the empty road. It was a long drive home, and the rain made it harder to see, even with the wipers working overtime. I was about 15 minutes from home when I saw her. At first, she was just a faint figure on the side of the road, barely visible through the rain. My headlights caught the edge of something, so I slowed down, squinting through the water-smeared windshield. There she was, a girl walking along the side of the road, no umbrella, soaked to the bone. She wasn't dressed for the weather at all. A light, pale dress clung to her body, and her long, dark hair hung in wet strands over her face. It wasn't just her presence in the middle of nowhere during a rainstorm that made me uneasy. It was the way she moved, slowly, as if she wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Instinctively, I pulled over. I lowered my window just a crack, enough for my voice to get out. "Hey, are you all right?" She stopped and turned towards me. Her face was shadowed by the rain and the angle of the headlights, but I saw her hesitate. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound reassuring. The rain was coming down harder, and leaving her out there didn't feel right. There was a long pause before she nodded. I unlocked the door, and she slipped into the passenger seat without a word. The smell of rain filled the car as she sat down, dripping water onto the seat. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She stared straight ahead, hands resting in her lap, fingers pale and slender. "Where are you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. She was silent for a moment, almost like she hadn't heard me. Then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear her, she said, "Just up the road." Her answer didn't feel right, but I kept driving. "All right, I'll drop you off wherever you need." We drove in silence after that. I kept sneaking glances at her, trying to make sense of her. The dim light in the car didn't help, but something about her presence felt unsettling. Her dress was too light for the weather, her hair was a tangled, wet mess, and she barely moved her head, tilted slightly downward, as if lost in thought. After a few minutes, I broke the silence again. "Were you coming from a party or something? I didn't expect to see anyone walking around here this late." She didn't respond right away. When she did, it felt like she wasn't really answering the question. "I've been walking for a while." That was it. Nothing more. A knot tightened in my stomach. Something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I decided to drop the conversation. If she wanted to stay quiet, I wasn't going to push her. We drove for a few more minutes, and the rain got worse. My headlights barely cut through the downpour now, and the road felt even more isolated. No houses, no signs, just dark trees pressing in from both sides. "Is it much farther?" I asked, trying to shake the growing unease gnawing at me. The rain beat down harder, and I could barely see the road ahead. I flicked on the high beams, hoping for better visibility, and then I saw it up ahead. At the end of the road was a cemetery. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't driven this way in years and had forgotten about it entirely. But there was the old cemetery, its rusted gate barely visible through the rain. My skin prickled. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. I slowed the car to a stop just outside the gate. I turned to her, unsure of what to say. "Are you visiting someone here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the door handle and stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the downpour before I could react. I watched her walk toward the gate, her figure dissolving into the mist and rain until she was completely gone. For a moment, I just sat there, staring after her, wondering if I should follow. But something deep inside told me not to. Something whispered that I didn't want to know what she was doing out there, that I shouldn't get involved. After a long moment, I put the car in reverse, turned around, and drove away from the cemetery. The rain let up slightly as I went, and the unease began to fade, at least until I looked over at the passenger seat. It was dry. Completely dry. I tried to make sense of it. There had been no trace of her, no wet seat, no water dripping onto the floor, nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all. I kept driving, my thoughts racing. Who was she? Why was she out there, walking toward the cemetery in the middle of the night? And more importantly, was she even real? The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty. But deep in my mind, I knew something about that night wasn't right, and it would stay with me long after the rain stopped. I left the party later than I had planned. It was one of those Halloween get-togethers where everyone was supposed to dress up, eat candy, and maybe have a couple of drinks. I didn't put much effort into my costume, just a black hoodie, some face paint, and I called it a night. It wasn't my scene anyway, but I had promised a friend I'd show up. That promise kept me there long enough to see most people leave. By 1 a.m., I decided I'd had enough. It had been raining on and off the entire night, and by the time I stepped out of the house, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour. My car was parked a couple of blocks away, so I jogged down the slick pavement. The road was quiet, too quiet for Halloween. No trick-or-treaters, no late-night walkers. It was just me and the sound of my sneakers splashing through the puddles. Once I got to my car, I sat there for a moment, letting the sound of the rain against the windshield relax me. It felt good to be alone, away from the noise and costumes. The thought of a warm bed was the only thing keeping me going at that point. I turned on the engine, flipped the windshield wipers on, and pulled out onto the empty road. It was a long drive home, and the rain made it harder to see, even with the wipers working overtime. I was about 15 minutes from home when I saw her. At first, it was just a faint figure on the side of the road, barely visible through the rain. My headlights caught the edge of something, so I slowed down, squinting through the water-smeared windshield. There she was, a girl walking along the side of the road. She had no umbrella and was soaked to the bone. She wasn't wearing anything that made sense for the weather alight. Pale dress clung to her frame, and her long, dark hair hung in damp strands over her face. It wasn't just the fact that she was out in the middle of nowhere in the rain that made me uneasy. It was the way she walked slowly, like she wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Instinct kicked in, and I pulled over. I lowered my window just a crack, enough for my voice to get out. "Hey, are you all right?" She stopped and turned toward me. Her face was shadowed by the rain and the angle of the headlights, but I could see her hesitate. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound reassuring. The rain was coming down harder now, and the thought of leaving her out there alone didn't sit right with me. There was a long pause before she finally nodded. I unlocked the door, and she slipped into the passenger seat without a word. The smell of rain filled the car as she sat down, dripping water onto the seat. I looked at her out of the corner of my eye. She was staring straight ahead, hands resting in her lap, fingers pale and slender. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. She was quiet for a moment, almost like she hadn't heard me. Then, in a voice so soft I could barely make it out, she said, "Just up the road." That answer didn't quite feel right, but I kept driving. "All right. I'll drop you off wherever you need." We drove in silence after that. I kept sneaking glances at her, trying to make sense of her. The dim light inside the car didn't help, but there was something unsettling about her presence. Her dress was odd for the weather, completely impractical. Her hair, matted and wet, looked like it hadn't been washed in days. Her stillness unnerved me. She barely moved, her head tilted slightly down as if she was lost in thought. After a few minutes, I broke the silence again. "Were you coming from a party or something? I didn't expect to see anyone walking around out here this late." She didn't respond right away, and when she did, it was almost like she wasn't answering the question at all. "I've been walking for a while," she said. That was it, nothing more. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to drop it. If she wanted to keep quiet, I wasn't going to push her. We drove for a few more minutes, and the rain seemed to get worse. My headlights barely cut through the downpour now, and the road felt even more isolated. No houses, no signs of life, just dark trees pressing in from both sides. "Is it much farther?" I asked, trying to shake the growing unease gnawing at me. She lifted her head slightly and finally turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide but distant, like she was looking through me rather than at me. "Just keep going," she whispered. The rain beat down harder, and I could barely see the road ahead. I flicked on the high beams, hoping for better visibility. Then I saw it up ahead. At the end of the road was a cemetery. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't driven this way in years and had forgotten all about it. But there was the old cemetery, its rusted gate barely visible through the rain. My skin prickled. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. I slowed the car, bringing it to a stop just outside the gate. I turned to her, unsure of what to say. "Are you visiting someone here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the door handle and stepped out of the car, disappearing into the downpour before I could react. I watched her walk toward the gate, her figure dissolving into the mist and rain until she was completely gone. For a moment, I just sat there, staring after her, wondering if I should follow. But something told me not to. Something deep inside whispered that I didn't want to know what she was doing out here, that I shouldn't get involved. After a long moment, I put the car in reverse, turned around, and headed back down the road, away from the cemetery. The rain let up slightly as I drove, and the unease began to fade at least until I looked over at the passenger seat. It was dry. Completely dry. I tried to make sense of it. There had been no trace of her. No wet seat. No water dripping onto the floor. Nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all. I kept driving, my thoughts racing. Who was she? Why was she out there, walking toward the cemetery in the middle of the night? And more importantly, was she even real? The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty. But deep in my mind, I knew something about that night wasn't right, and it would stay with me long after the rain stopped.